This week is the first of 3 units in which we'll be looking at different poetic forms from the Romantic period. When we talk about a poem's form, we're really just talking about the set of rules that it follows, maybe a preset rhyme scheme, or a specific kind of meter, or how the lines are organized. This week we'll study the ode, and we'll start with the most basic question. What's an ode? Well, it's a poem in praise of something, which means it's a public form, the kind of thing you recite in front of an audience to show appreciation. You can see how it has its roots in performance, emphasizing the oral nature of poetry. It's also an old form, going back to the Greeks. Let's talk for a minute about what an ode is not. The ode is not an elegy. Odes celebrate, elegies lament. An ode is not a sonnet. Odes have more than one stanza. An ode is not a ballad. Ballads tell stories, often with morals, while an ode generally doesn't tell a story and remains focused on the subject it celebrates. Now that we know what makes an ode different from some of the other forms, let's talk about the features of the ode. The two ode forms that matter in English poetry are the Horatian ode and the Pindaric ode. Here are some of the differences between the two. A Horatian ode has several stanzas that share the same meter and rhyme scheme. Every line rhymes with at least one other line from the stanza. The Horatian ode most often deals with themes of friendship, love, and are more personal, meditative, and restrained. The Pindaric ode is written either in 3 stanzas or in 3 longer sections. The first 2 sections have the same structure, while the third has a different structure. We have a name for these 3 parts of a Pindaric ode, and they are called the strophe, antistrophe, and epode. Pindar got the idea for his ode structure from the movements of the chorus in Greek theater. The Greek chorus dances to music on stage, walking in one direction during the first portion, doubling back during the second portion, and then standing still during the third. This 3-part structure forms the basis for the strophe, antistrophe, and epode. The 3-part structure of the Pindaric ode can be used to frame the rhetoric of a poem. You might find a strophe and antistrophe that present a point and counterpoint, while the epode tries to reconcile these 2 opposing views. Or you might find a strophe and an antistrophe that provide 2 separate interpretations, and an epode that presents a third. Typically, the epode is the shortest portion of a Pindaric ode, and it's the most incisive. This is the part of the poem where you'd look for a moral or a justification. Now, arguably the most famous writer of odes from this period, a poet who needs very little introduction, is John Keats. Keats belonged to the second generation of Romantic poets and to a group of poets we refer to as the Cockney School. The term Cockney originally just meant a city dweller, and now often refers to people living in East London who speak in Cockney dialect or with a Cockney accent. Now, if you've ever seen the movie My Fair Lady, then you're familiar with Cockney English, and you know that it's associated with the lower classes. The plot of My Fair Lady is simple. Professor Henry Higgins discovers Eliza Doolittle selling flowers in Covent Garden and decides that he wants to teach her to speak and behave like a refined woman. Here's a clip in which Eliza Doolittle, played by Audrey Hepburn, speaks in Cockney dialect, confronting Henry Higgins, who has documented her Cockney speech in his phonetic alphabet.
What you take down me words for? How do I know you took me down right? You just show me what you wrote about me. Oh. What's that ain't proper writing? I can't read it.
I can. I say, Captain, now buy your flour off a poor gal.
Oh, it's 'cause I called him Captain.
Now, as you can imagine, for Keats and for the Cockney School poets, there was a considerable anxiety around being labeled a Cockney. Unlike Robert Burns and John Clare, 2 poets who came from the countryside and wrote about their rural roots, these poets did not have the pleasurable aesthetic of the countryside to fall back on. Keats was born into a middle-class family. His father worked for a livery company that stabled horses and died in a riding accident when Keats was only 8 years old. His mother died 6 years later. Keats nursed her on her deathbed and grew to know firsthand the pains of dying from tuberculosis. Keats went to medical school and studied what was then thought of as the easiest specialty, and that's pharmacy. It was the equivalent of being a general practitioner, not a physician like the kind who attended the Physicians' College in London. Despite his training, Keats never actually worked as a doctor, which was kind of amazing for a man of his class. He managed to live off of a small annuity left by his parents. Keats seemed generally to avoid the political baggage of Shelley and Byron, and was considered for most of the 20th century as the supreme aesthetic poet, glorified as the exemplary performer, elevated by Harvard critics to near rock star status when, of course, Keats could never have gotten into Harvard. Keats was middle class every moment of his life, and he was forever conscious of it. He's the only one of the big six romantic poets, except for Blake, who didn't go to Oxford or Cambridge. In 1816, after he lands his first published poem in his friend Leigh Hunt's journal, he gives up medicine and becomes a full-time poet, living here at Wentworth Place in Hampstead in North London. In the years after, he publishes 3 books of poetry before he dies in 1821. Keats's brother Tom died at 19 years old in 1818, and in early 1819 Keats is depressed and he starts seeing more of a young woman named Fanny Brawne. This quote comes from a letter written to Fanny after seeing her in October of 1819. He wrote, "You have ravished me away by power I cannot resist, and yet I could resist till I saw you. And ever since I have seen you, I have endeavored often to reason against the reasons of my love. I can do no more, the pain would be too great. My love is selfish. I cannot breathe without you." He was 23 at this point, and as you can see, a little bit melodramatic. But it was at around this time that he began writing his great odes. Keats grew ill in February of 1820, and he realized that he had tuberculosis. The doctors advised him to move to Rome, and so he leaves in October of 1820 for Rome. He dies at 11 p.m. on the 23rd of February, 1821, and is buried in the Protestant cemetery in Rome.